Welcome to another edition of Cooperatives in a Time of Crisis Conversation series. My name is Jen Budney, and I am a professional research associate at the Canadian Centre for the Study of Cooperatives at the University of Saskatchewan. And I am super thrilled to have on the other end of this Zoom call with me today, Melissa Hoover, who is the founding executive director of the Democracy at Work Institute based all over the US. Welcome, Melissa.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So I'm wondering if you could begin very briefly telling me a little bit about how you came to be involved in workers' co-ops and how you came to be the founding executive director of Democracy at Work Institute.
Yeah, so I sort of like to think that I fell into this work or that it was a little bit of an accident, but actually when I trace my thinking back farther, I see a thread of intention. So I studied cooperatives in college. I studied women on the Iron Range in Minnesota and the consumer cooperative movement as a way to build people's power. And then I graduated and didn't know what to do with myself, basically, and eventually ended up several years later getting a job at a cooperative printing company in the Bay Area where I lived, and was just fascinated by the workings and the sort of the mechanisms and processes and structures. So I started getting more involved in cooperative organizing. That was right at the time around the early 2000s when local organizing was taking off in the Bay Area and the national organizing worker co-ops were beginning to come together and create create bodies and networks. And I started just sort of jumping in at a pretty exciting time.
And so can you tell me how the Democracy at Work Institute came to be? It's an organization that serves workers' cooperatives.
Yeah, so there was a conference in, I think 2004, it might have been 2003, I think 2004, when a group of organizers from worker cooperatives across the country came together to form the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives. And the Canadian Worker Co-op Federation was actually present there to advise and give support. And the organization launched at that founding meeting. There was enough momentum and interest. And it had always been the intention from the beginning to have a membership organization, a member-based kind of advocacy and support group for members, and then to create a nonprofit alongside it to do like training and education. And so that was the genesis of the Democracy at Work Institute, was the vision of the founders of the Federation. But pretty early on in the lifetime of the Federation, we realized that there was an opportunity and a need for something a little bit more robust than just training and education, that there could be a nonprofit that really drove growth and innovation in the field. And there was this moment of generational change happening in worker co-ops where, previously they had been sort of used as a strategy by people who had alternatives and options to exit the mainstream economy because of their politics. And that was shifting a bit to being to the form being used by people who didn't have other options to enter the economy, and that needed a whole different kind of support and resources and organizing. And so when Democracy at Work Institute finally launched in 2012, it was with a much broader purview than just education and training. It was really to drive growth in the movement.
So when you were in Saskatoon last year when the Canadian Centre for the Study of Cooperatives had its relaunch, and you were the keynote speaker, and in that talk that you did, you talked about the three generations of cooperative building in North America, and I thought that was a really interesting and useful way to think about how co-ops have been conceived in the last 100 years. And I'm wondering if you could, because you just touched on that in your last comments, I'm wondering if you could describe those three generations a little bit, and then we can go into more in depth into the current generation and the communities you serve.
Sure, and it really honestly extends farther back even than the three generations that I touched on. There's a cooperative tradition, going back centuries. But in the most recently completed century, we sort of see these three generations. The Depression and onwards. And obviously co-ops there came out of a need for people to be economically self-sufficient. The second generation, I think, was around the 70s, more countercultural, similar, obviously, principles and values, but I think a little bit of a different kind of animating impulse, which was to change the economy broadly and to provide kind of alternative institutions. And then in the 90s and early 2000s, we saw people who, were really locked out of jobs and small business ownership as the economy consolidated and shifted through, in the sort of post-war period. By the 90s, people were really in crisis in terms of being able to access living wage jobs, and so started to form co-ops to create jobs for themselves. And that's where we are now. That's the majority of growth in worker co-ops in the last 10, 15 years is women and people of color, primarily in service industry jobs. Although there's a sort of another strand happening right now, which are small business employees taking over the businesses that they work for. Still, though, driven by like real economic needs as a part of the shifts in our economy.
So where specifically do we see these worker co-ops? It's they are in the healthcare sector, I would imagine, home care, daycare. Where else do you see them?
Yeah, there's a lot of care economy startup organizing, and I think that comes out of the sort of the isolation and atomization of care providers and the exploitative nature of the industry. There just are not. The jobs are underpaid. We don't have the right kind of social safety net and support for those kind of jobs to be adequately paid. And then the industry really varies in its practices. So there's been a lot of growth in the startup of care economy cooperatives, so child care and home care primarily, some elder care. And they're mostly small scale initiatives, although we are starting to see some larger ones. In fact, the largest worker co-op in the US, started several decades ago, is a home care agency, explicitly started with the proposition to make those jobs better jobs by building a worker owned entity and having it be affiliated with a training entity and a policy entity. But I think, as inequality increases, people who are feeling that inequality, and I mean like really feeling that inequality. So we're moving, I think, especially in a post-COVID world, from the sort of stretched social safety net and people really on the margins. I think people are going to fall off the margins. Like it's not just an inequality, sort of a growing inequality problem that we can sort of talk about and try to address. We're moving into a full-blown crisis, I think, of, mass poverty, mass job loss. People are hungry. The lines out of the food banks right now are, I think, a pretty damning indictment of our economy. And so people are hurting. They're left out, and they've dropped out of the economy because there are no good jobs for them. So that primarily, to get back to your question, that primarily locates itself in the service sector, but we're also seeing people who work gig economy jobs like drivers, or who cook for their neighbors, or who take care of their, families, kids, trying to figure out ways to make that income generating activity that has some protections around it. So as people are losing jobs and doing economic activity for themselves, they're beginning to sort of explore how that might pull that into worker co-ops. So I think that's one of the drivers of growth. The other one that we really, I think, need to pay attention to, especially in a time of inequality, is there are millions of viable small businesses that employ millions of people. And many of those business owners are older. And as we've seen in the post-COVID environment, they're closing. They don't have enough cash on hand to stay open, or they're like tired and want to be done with it. And when they close, we lose those jobs forever, because the landscape for starting a small business is not the same as it was when they started 30 years ago. So there's both this sort of people really who have fallen through people who the economy has not served, starting their own things. And then there are these businesses and employees that the economy currently serving, but are very much in imminent danger of closing. So there's a way we can use worker ownership to buy out those enterprises and keep them going. And I think of it as a sort of it's not the crisis response that contingent workers are undertaking. It's more of a sort of, can we preserve what we already have and stop inequality from increasing that way?
So I find it really overwhelming when I think about what people in the United States are facing right now, and this kind of double tidal wave or earthquake of first the 2016 elections and now the COVID-19 pandemic. So it must be on some level for those of you who are trying to help solve some of these problems pretty overwhelming, pretty like where do you even begin in trying to address what's happening to the economy right now? What are the priorities for the Democracy at Work Institute?
Well, in some ways, it's actually pretty clarifying, this moment. So it is overwhelming, but the needs are making themselves known, right? The economy has been leveled. So you can really see how precarious people were, how precarious small businesses were. And those needs are now really visible and evident in a way that they weren't necessarily to the naked eye a couple years ago. We knew that, and the data shows, and but there's enough there's enough sort of narrative denial, but also enough for people to hang on to that they weren't completely sort of without options. And so it was actually a little bit harder to navigate and to make the case for cooperatives before this hit, because the narrative of the US economy is so powerful that even though the data was out there and the actual human beings who are suffering are out there, there was this sort of perception that, like, this is a boom time, we're doing really well. Why would we need to explore this sort of unconventional business form? Now we have policymakers coming to us saying, our city is in crisis, our workforce is in crisis. Can this form be used to address that crisis? And that's what co-ops are for. They're there to meet people's needs. So in times of great need, we don't actually have to sell the concept as hard. It sells itself. And one of my mentors always says the challenge of co-ops is to make it through the good times. And I think that there's some truth in that. The priorities for us right now are that sort of twofold response. First, to preserve existing assets that are businesses that function, that employ people, to make sure that as many of them as possible can stay running and can benefit the people who work in them. In many cases, a lot of those businesses don't have anyone to buy them. The owner wants to sell, but there is no buyer, or the buyer is a private equity company that's going to strip it for parts and close the business anyway. So our first priority is retaining that ecosystem of small businesses that really drives our economy. And at the same time, opening up the possibility that ownership of those businesses could really broadly benefit workers and communities. There is a moment to say that's more, that's more powerful, that's more resilient, and people can hear that now. And then our second priority is to address to use worker ownership to address the really dire needs of people who don't have jobs or who have extremely contingent, precarious jobs, to help them use whatever co-op form makes sense to build access and protection and some resiliency into the work that they're already doing or wanting to do.
So how are you doing this work? What is it through policy proposals? Is it through education? Is it through all of these things? What sort of outreach are you doing to encourage, co-op conversions? If we just address your first point, how are you reaching out to small businesses or to people that are in touch with small businesses to encourage this type of transition?
I think it's important to understand about us. We do a lot of direct work. We do a lot of training and technical assistance and education, but really early on, what we saw was there are a lot of really good organizations out there doing the work in their locality and in their industry, and that our best role might be to help knit them together, help them share practices and get resources. So a lot of what we do is the sort of field building work of convening the groups that are doing the work and helping them do it better. So we have a couple communities of practice. One of the TA providers around the country who do technical assistance for conversions. It's called the Workers to Owners Collaborative, and it has about 50 members in it now, all across the country, who coordinate their work. And then we do another community of practice, the Shared Equity and Economic Development Fellowship for cities around the country. And these are city officials and nonprofit organizations who work in teams in their city and then across cities to explore broad-based ownership strategies that the city might take. We started that a couple of years ago, and we're not sure if there was going to be interest, but in fact, there was greater interest than we had planned, and now we're swamped with cities that are like, what kind of tools can we use? So I think those two activities sort of speak to our model is an ecosystem model. We don't think we can do it alone. We don't think technical assistance providers can do it alone. We think we have to sort of operate at all the levels that the economy and society operate at. So training and direct support, but pulling people together, also working on policy. And we do a lot of research and data gathering to better understand. That was one of the things when we started, we realized no one had been tracking worker co-ops or their impact. We didn't really have a lot of data-based intelligence about what was working and not working. So we've started to do, so everything we do, we track with data, which is not the thing that excites people, but is like really critical for how to, to build a sector. And then recently we have been working on policy because we hadn't necessarily planned to do policy. We hadn't seen a lot of opportunities when we started 7 years ago. There just wasn't a whole lot of interest on the part of local or federal governments in worker ownership, and I can definitively say that that has changed. A couple of years ago, we got a federal bill passed that is specifically designed to support worker ownership through the Small Business Administration. It's called the Main Street Employee Ownership Act. And then through our seed work in cities around the country, we're starting to see local policies get drafted. And then through the work of our partners at the state level, we've seen several states take up initiatives to make it easier to support worker cooperatives, to do some funding for technical assistance. And increasingly, we're looking at like tax policy and tax incentives. So I think that there's this moment, and the moment was starting before COVID, but it has really accelerated since.
Mm-hmm. So could you briefly describe that federal bill that you got in? How does it support worker cooperatives?
Well, so the main infrastructure here in the US for small businesses is the Small Business Administration. They have capital. That's the primary thing they do, is lend to small businesses, but they also run these small business development centers all around the country, which is sort of one-stop shop for business owners. And the bill directs them to lend to worker co-ops and for the small business development centers to make information available and to train their staff. The challenge has been actually implementing it, right? You have this massive bureaucracy that doesn't understand or know much about employee ownership or worker cooperatives. And so uptake has been slow, but that's the beauty of having a coordinated national community, is that we can educate all of those small business development centers and really help them. So the bigger lift actually has been implementation. The bill itself passed with bipartisan support and almost, very little friction. So there's an appetite, I think, federally for doing that. And we get in where we fit in with policy, and where we fit in was the Small Business Administration at the moment. But I think it's also part of our kind of approach and the way we think things are going to change is we do want to support the worker cooperative community and all of its institutions and developers. That's the core of what we do. But there's this expansion that we think needs to happen. Worker cooperatives are not going to grow to a meaningful scale on our own. We're going to do that by embedding in existing systems of support. So in many ways, it's a real win to be in the Small Business Administration's priorities. I will say post-COVID, there's been a real change in the appetite, both at the Small Business Administration and in other US agencies. And I think a change in our ambition for policy. So just for instance, the Main Street Employee Ownership Act took a couple of years of organizing to write and pass, and then it'll take many more years of implementation support. And we still didn't get one of the main things we wanted, which was to waive personal guarantees for co-ops because, you have a ton of people in a co-op. It's not realistic for them all to personally guarantee a loan. And we didn't get sort of an explicit acknowledgement of the benefits of worker ownership either. But we did get both of those things in the second relief bill. So the PPP and so in the US, the relief packages that support small businesses after COVID, as part of the advocacy around those bills, we got the personal guarantees waived for some of the SBA lending programs for a limited amount of time that we hope will actually last longer. And we got a written explicit acknowledgement from the Small Business Administration of the cooperative form. So things are possible now that were not, years we've been trying to do those things, and they very quickly were able to happen because we need new tools.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. So I don't know if I want to go to your second point about the, let's just stay on that bill for a minute. What do you hope will come out of this in the long term? What do you see as a set of possibilities for worker cooperatives?
Well, I think in the immediate term and the sort of short to middle term, I hope that every small business owner who wants to retire considers selling to their employees as a matter of course. And not out of a sort of ideological commitment, although being able to see the benefits I think is really important, but just that it's a practically available option. I hope that, when they're talking to their small business center or getting a loan or exploring with a business broker how to exit their business, that they just consider selling to their employees, that they know enough about it to make an informed choice, and that employees themselves know enough about it to take that risk and to be willing to step into business ownership. So I think if we could capture even a small percentage of retiring business owners through employee ownership, that would be a massive expansion of employee ownership in this country, and in a way that meets an extremely pressing need. So the small business development infrastructure should be able to support that. There are business advisors and coaches. There's, loans that can support transitions. So that's just the sort of the basics. That is achievable and possible. I think for the longer term, what I'd really like to see is an active, not just using the infrastructure that already exists, but like an active commitment on the part of local, state, and federal government to support employee ownership because it has benefits. Broad-based ownership, community ownership should be a part of our economic development toolbox in a way that it is just completely absent right now. And in my vision, that starts with the federal government saying, this form has very clear benefits. We're going to inject some capital. We're going to inject some federal funding to drive the growth of the sector at a critical moment in time. And that'll take advocacy and some initiative. It's not just about sort of like sharing information and making already existing resources available. It's about driving something. Then there's precedent for this to address the food deserts in poor communities. several years ago, almost a decade ago now, the Healthy Foods Financing Initiative came together in the US. It's a multi-agency initiative. It involved several, like I think USDA and the Department of Treasury, to all say, you know, poor communities need food access. Farmers, small farmers need support. Grocery stores need to get built. So they came together and they brought capital and technical assistance and government funding, and they worked with nonprofit agencies to build a food system that now is incredibly important as we face a global pandemic. Poor communities and communities across the country have access to food in a way that they wouldn't have if that didn't exist, and if that sector hadn't been built up. And what I'd like to see is in 10 years, when there's another global crisis, we're going to see more and more of them, that there's an infrastructure in place that builds that kind of community resilience, and that it leverages all the parts of the government and capital and community institutions so that people have an option for selling their business, for starting a business, for creating work for themselves.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to be speaking with Hazel Corcoran from the Canadian Workers Cooperative Federation later today, and she just sent me some information about what they're doing. They have petitioned the federal government here in Canada for $70 million investment to help the CWCF work with small businesses to transition them to workers cooperatives. And you know, we have a much smaller population here in Canada, and so it's easier to kind of keep track of what's happening where. To my knowledge, this kind of direct ask is not something that your organization has done. It sounds to me like one of the reasons for not doing that might be because you're dealing with an infinitely more complicated spiderweb of organizations and jurisdictions than we are in Canada. But maybe you've got other thoughts on that.
No, I think you're right. I mean, there's a scale issue here in the US that makes it a little more challenging. But I will say, you know, as we're looking at the COVID relief strategy, we did get a small concession in the first aid package and some support via the Small Business Administration, at least verbally. And as we look at future aid packages, and in particular, as we look at like rebuilding initiatives, we do have our eyes on some major asks. So part of it is the complexity of our government, state, local system, and part of it are just the number of players. So one of the roles I hope that we play in the field is to convene conversations of the major organizations around the country to kind of align on an ask. So we're in the process of having that complicated, messy conversation right now, surfacing everybody's ideas, understanding like what the kind of incremental asks are and then what the big ones might be, framing them up and finding champions. We do have some champions within the federal government, particularly in the House of Representatives. And then we have some state initiatives. So I think we're taking we're taking our time to build the strategic ask, but we're also taking a little bit of a throw everything at the wall and see what sticks strategy, in terms of like some states have already, you know, started working on integrating employee ownership. We're looking at some getting into the relief packages. We're working with some Congress people on other kinds of bills. Congressman Ro Khanna just drafted a worker co-op support bill for the House that does contain those kinds of asks. It probably won't make it all the way through the process this time, but it's an educational piece, and it's out there now for when conditions change. And as we see, conditions can change quite quickly. Mm-hmm. So it's a little bit of a cat herding situation, actually, in that there are a lot of ideas and a lot of initiatives, and I think the challenge is to really focus them and make a really clear ask. And my shout out to the Canadian Worker Co-op Federation for doing that so quickly and so clearly.
So at the risk of moving from a really a topic that has a lot of hope and excitement, something more depressing, I want to get back to your second point about people working in very precarious industries. And I know here there's been a lot of discussion in Canada about the meaning of essential workers, because we found out very quickly when the COVID shutdown started to happen that a lot of our very poorly paid workers in areas such as childcare, we haven't even talked about house cleaning yet. These workers were suddenly labeled essential workers, and yet they work with very few protections. And I think within that sector, there's just so much uncertainty about how and when the businesses will be able to operate again. Whether they are, here there's a lot of immigrant women working in house cleaning services, and I imagine that they've been, for the most part, shut down on account of COVID. Childcare centers are in very uncertain situations too. We don't know when they're going to be back open again, how many kids are going to be allowed. So this, there's it goes on. I think the CWCF mentioned that the only area where this has not been, I've got children and dogs at my at my door here. The only area where we've seen these kinds of businesses not hard hit is in the there are paramedic cooperatives in Quebec,
right?
And so their businesses, of course, are still going strong, unfortunately. But I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about your concerns for these sorts of sectors, and if the same kind of conversations about what it means to be an essential worker if you're so poorly paid and so poorly protected, if those conversations are happening in the US now, and if you see any possibility for the treatment of those sectors, of those workers, changing at the end of this tunnel we're in on account of the kind of new realizations that these workers are essential.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think I'm an optimist, so I think that we're in a terrible time right now, and people are suffering and dying, and we're all inside, and the people who aren't inside are really dangerously exposed with very few protections. And that changes people, that changes individual people, and it changes our society. And I guess my hope is that out of this, we're going to have a reprioritization of what matters, and there will be a regeneration of activity around how we structure an economy that works. I mean, I think that we're on the cusp of potentially some really enormous creativity as people say, wait a minute, we're rethinking everything, right? You don't, and our tools are different now too. So, I mean, I actually think, I'm also really interested in cross-class organizing. So we have doctors and nurses who are essential workers also, and who are suffering and who are not protected in a healthcare system that's broken, right alongside home care workers and childcare workers who are not protected in a broken system. Unions aren't able to organize independent workers, and so many of them aren't in unions, and unions have really taken a hit here. So the sort of the old go-tos of well, we organize a union, that's been effectively dismantled by the right, and yet how you build power is to aggregate people, and there are a lot of different forms for aggregating people, and it's my hope that the cooperative form can be one of those aggregators that actually is used not only to meet people's practical needs, but to build their power to advocate for themselves and to negotiate within the market. So on an abstract level, I think, one of the things we try to do is make the co-op available as a tool to people who are looking for a tool, who aren't necessarily looking for a co-op, but are looking to solve a problem or address an issue. So by that measure, we're in a time of enormous opportunity because people are looking for a tool. And so I think that there's a chance to create cooperatives that address some of those gaps for both low-wage workers and higher wage workers who have more access to resources. But that doesn't happen only by people just creating co-ops, right? We're not going to solve the problem by some sort of mass renaissance of, letting a thousand flowers bloom of co-ops. That takes a policy muscle that says, this is important. This is a part of our social fabric. We believe in the power of this to actually make our communities better. And that's where I get a little bit less optimistic right now. The US policy environment, we can push things through, and we are actively trying that. But the sort of broader kind of social commitment to low-wage workers and to essential workers, I haven't seen it, right? I haven't seen those kinds of protections being discussed, and the sort of the longer term structural changes that need to happen. So I think cooperatives can be part of that conversation, but they're not the end point of that conversation. It needs to be a conversation with unions, with employers, and with like workforce advocates. And I think, I don't know, it's a part of our resilience as not just as a country, but as a world, for us to be able to, like, it's actually the key part of our resilience. If these essential workers are in fact essential, they should be protected. And I think we've had this kind of narrative around resilience that says like, well, co-ops are more resilient because they can share the pain. And so a co-op of essential workers might be able to share the pain and share each other's duties, but also kind of like the economic difficulty to be able to share that. But I think that's actually the wrong approach to resilience. I mean, it's an incomplete approach to resilience, because it sort of pushes the responsibility for bearing the pain further and further down the line till you're out at the individual who's part of a co-op. I actually want to think about resilience as pushing it up the line and saying, what are the institutions that can support people, not just as workers, but aggregated into these formations that are co-ops or unions or whatever, and think about social resilience that way. And it's just challenging. It could go either way at this point, right? Or it could go any way. And I think it's really up to us, those of us who organize business and workers and capital, to say, we think it should go this way.
Yeah, I think actually you make a really interesting point, because a lot of the literature around cooperatives actually isolates co-ops and talks about models of success based on the individual organization alone, how it's governed and the decisions it makes, when really a great deal of success for cooperatives is the result of its broader environment, its relationships with other institutions and with policies and government and all of that. So this idea that resilience is not something that can be located even in an individual or an individual organization, but has to be connected to a web of institutions is really interesting to me. Yeah. That isn't what we talk about in the co-op sector usually.
Right, we say, look, co-ops survive longer, or co-op members have more access, and those are key metrics. Those are, nothing else matters if we aren't meeting those needs, but they're not the end point at all. And if we outsource our understanding of resilience down to that level, then we are not actually building resilient ecosystems.
Mm-hmm. We've covered a lot of ground here. I'm wondering if there's anything else that you wanted to add about what you're going through. I guess I have one last question, which is, how has this impacted your work? How has this impacted the work of the Democracy at Work Institute? I can imagine that you are busier than ever, and you were already very busy.
Well, yeah, I mean, the sort of the moment of opportunity that we were feeling ourselves a part of has changed a little bit, in that it's accelerated to the extent that a crisis is also an opportunity. It's accelerated. So in the immediate term, there's an enormous need for the resources and services that we provide. We're getting a lot more inquiries from a lot more diverse places. Our partners are also beginning to field a lot more inquiries. I mean, at first, the world went quiet. And now, as we're ramping back up, people are looking around and asking questions. So the work has increased. The policy work is really increased as we're sort of trying to manage all of the various places that policy is beginning to be written. And we want to be proactive and first in line. So that's a really high priority for us, is to push policy work forward. At the same time, there is this kind of like longer term and deeper work of coordinating our field and reaching out to our allies to say, what are we trying to build, you know, for the next decades? And let's like think about that from a policy perspective, but also in our own practice in capital. I mean, I think that we haven't talked much about it today, but there's a lot of capital potentially available for transitioning businesses or starting businesses, but a lot of it is locked up in institutions that can't or won't dedicate it to that purpose. And so there's this kind of puzzle right now. We're going to need money. Everybody's going to need money. And how do we kind of access, and a lot of the capital that's out there is sort of impact capital or investment that wants to make a difference in the world, should be the kind of thing that we use. And we should be able to access government capital to save small businesses and help new ones get started. But so far, that puzzle, no one has really unlocked that puzzle. So I think the money part of this whole equation is really maybe the most urgent part. You know, we need to do policy, we need to help people start and transition businesses, but in order to do that, you need money. So I think that's one of the things we're working on and talking about with our partners. But I think, and so that's the longer term plan, but you know, really in the immediate, like right now, we also serve the existing worker co-op sector, and worker cooperatives are small businesses, and they're in danger just like all other small businesses of going out of business. That many worker cooperatives are in the restaurant sector, they're in the care sector, they're vulnerable. Like most small businesses, they don't have cash to survive more than a 3-month shutdown. So there's some triage that needs to be done to protect the work of the last 15 years and make sure that those businesses can make it through and that they come out the other side stronger and you know, with more access. So I think that we're trying to work on like several scales, right? The immediate, the midterm, the long-term rebuilding. It's just a little overwhelming. And I think something has happened in the last couple of weeks in the world writ large. It seems like for a lot of remote workers, and we're incredibly lucky to be able to work from home, everyone's work has just like exponentially increased as we're trying to figure out like how to work from home and how to do things effectively. So I don't know, it's a really weird time. And I think as the world begins to reopen, the work is only going to grow. And we've been mostly lucky to have been able to retain most of our funding and be able to continue to do the work. I think at the federal government is spending money left and right, some of it in the right places, some of it not. But state and local governments are going broke because they're feeling the effects of the pandemic and dealing with them locally. So I think our work there looks really different in that they have need and appetite and no money. So figuring out how to work in that environment is a real challenge.
Yeah, and from everything that we can read, this virus isn't going away anytime soon. So we're in a period of trying to cope with all of this uncertainty and perhaps rolling shutdowns again when we have second waves and third waves. So there's this strange time could be with us for quite a while.
Yeah, and I think the social movement actors, I think we were all sort of caught off guard and stunned by this. But it's also, the co-op sector is responding and has responded pretty quickly here in the US. And I think new economy movements are responding. Workers' rights movements are starting to come back online and really respond. So there's a way that I think none of us have to do it alone. It's really hard to say that when we're all stuck in our houses alone, like to envision like how you bring people together again. But I actually think we don't the danger here is to miss the opportunity to not just sort of on a practical level, although that's there, right? We need to get capital. We need to help people start and save their businesses. We need to beat private equity to the punch because they're already vulturing around small businesses, trying to pick the carcass. So, you know, we have to act quickly in a resource kind of a way, but I also think we need to act maybe not quickly, but with kind of like due thoughtful haste with other movements to come together. That just is no time to be sort of siloing ourselves off into different ways of addressing this, where we need a sort of cohesive movement level response. And I've been really heartened by some of the new economy groups here in the US who are saying, like, who are seeing the connections and pulling these conversations together. Because we are at a systems change moment. I mean, this is an inflection point. We don't come back from this going back to normal. And we have an opportunity to say what that new normal is and to really push for it. And I think people can hear it right now. People at all levels can hear it right now. And that's the opportunity.
So that seems like a really good point to end this conversation. Melissa Hoover, thank you so much for joining us. I want to wish you and everybody at the Democracy at Work Institute all the best over the coming weeks and months, and I'm sure we'll be in contact again before a year is up. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be able to talk about these things with you.